It was on one of those raw, fog-draped evenings in late November when I first became aware of the strange affair that would soon dominate our thoughts. Holmes and I had returned from a day's walk through Regent's Park, and the damp air had driven us to the comfort of our hearth. Mrs. Hudson had just set down the lamp when there came a sharp rap at the door. Within moments, Inspector Lestrade entered, his lean figure tense, his expression oddly unsettled for a man not unused to crime. "I'll warrant you've never seen a case like this, Mr. Holmes," he began, dispensing with all pleasantries. A gentleman was discovered seated at table in his lodgings in Bloomsbury, supper laid, glass in hand, yet the fellow had been dead for hours before the food was served. And mark me, someone contrived to make it appear he dined after death. Holmes, who had been lounging with half-lidded eyes upon the settee, sat upright with a sudden, electric interest. "After death," he echoed, the two words clipped and resonant. "Pray, elaborate." Lestrade laid out the particulars with his customary brevity. The victim, one Mr. Percy Delacroix, a scholar of some repute, was found by his landlady that morning. His body bore no signs of struggle. Yet the scene suggested a freshly taken meal. Warm joints of meat, a dish scarcely touched, and claret poured into the glass at his right hand. The physician who first attended insisted, however, that Delacroix had been dead nearly 12 hours, long before that supper could have been prepared. Watson, myself, could not suppress a low exclamation. "Good heavens, Lestrade! Are you saying someone staged the man's dinner after he was already gone?" Holmes's long, delicate fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. His keen eyes gleamed with something between curiosity and amusement. "An excellent puzzle," he murmured. "We have before us the double enigma. Who killed Mr. Delacroix, and why go to the trouble of seating a corpse to supper? It is not mere theatrics, I am certain. It is subterfuge. The tableau is meant to divert, perhaps even to mislead as to the hour of death." Rising abruptly, he reached for his coat. "Watson, fetch your hat. Lestrade, I take it the scene remains untouched?" "As untouched as a lodging-house can be once a body's discovered," Lestrade replied. "Then we must make haste," Holmes declared. "Every moment wasted erodes the whispers of truth that linger in a room. The dead do not dine, gentlemen, but the living may feast upon deception." And with that, we set out into the fog-bound streets of London, little suspecting how labyrinthine and perilous the path ahead would prove. We emerged from Baker Street into a world muffled by mist. The gas lamps, halos of pale yellow in the gloom, struggled to illuminate more than a few paces ahead, and the clatter of passing hansom cabs was muted by the damp air. Holmes strode forward with his usual brisk determination, his long coat trailing behind him like a banner, while Lestrade and I hastened in his wake. The inspector, though clearly disturbed by what he had encountered, offered only fragments of information as we rode by cab toward the scene. He admitted that he had summoned Holmes at once because the inconsistencies unnerved even him. "I've seen many a ruse to delay discovery of a crime," he said, tugging irritably at his mustache. "But this is different. Too careful, too deliberate. Whoever staged it was cleverer than most criminals I know, and I dislike being made a fool of." Holmes chuckled softly, leaning back in the cab, his sharp profile outlined against the window's condensation. "Come, Lestrade, you need not reproach yourself. It is precisely because the act was deliberate that you sensed its falsity. That instinct is the beginning of wisdom. Still, instinct must be sharpened into reason." When we reached the Bloomsbury lodging-house, the street was hushed save for the drip of rain from eaves. The house itself was narrow, its windows dark save one on the first floor, where a constable kept vigil. A curious crowd had gathered earlier, but by the time of our arrival only a few lingered, whispering in tones that ceased abruptly as Holmes mounted the steps. Inside, the odor of extinguished fire mixed with the faint aroma of cooked meat. We were ushered upstairs by the landlady, a nervous woman in a faded shawl who wrung her hands ceaselessly. She repeated for us what she had told Lestrade, that she had entered late that morning to collect a dish and discovered her lodger sitting so stiff and white, with supper before him as though he'd only just begun. Holmes offered her the briefest of nods before stepping into the room. The scene that greeted us was one of eerie dissonance. Mr. Percy Delacroix, a man in his middle years, dark hair streaked with silver, sat at the small dining table in an upright posture. His head had drooped slightly forward, his hand resting on the table's edge, as if he had paused between mouthfuls. Before him lay a plate upon which rested a slice of cold beef, scarcely touched, and beside it a goblet half filled with claret. The hearth smouldered weakly, casting only a dim glow upon the walls lined with bookshelves. Yet the unnatural stillness of the figure, combined with the waxen pallor of his skin, betrayed at once that no spark of life remained within. Death clung to him like a shroud, however artfully disguised by the supper tableau. Holmes stood silently, his gaze sweeping over every detail with the intensity of a hawk surveying its prey. He drew close to the table, examining the arrangement of plate and glass, the crust of bread broken on the side dish, the utensils set neatly upon the cloth. Then he stooped low, peering at the body's posture, the angle of the limbs and the curious rigidity of the fingers. "Remarkable," he whispered at last. "Watson, your opinion?" I felt my cheeks warm under his sudden challenge. "The man is clearly dead, Holmes. The meal, however, appears recent. Yet the doctor, as Lestrade has said, found him to have been dead many hours. It suggests someone prepared this food and placed it before him long after death." Holmes smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching with approval. "Excellent, my dear fellow. You perceive the contradiction, which is the first step toward resolving it. But tell me, does anything strike you about the meal itself?" I looked again. The beef, the bread, the claret, ordinary enough fare for a bachelor's supper. Nothing unusual met my eye. "Only that it seems plain," I admitted, "for a man of letters reputed to have means." "Just so," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested further significance lay hidden. He turned then to Lestrade. "You said the physician estimated death at 12 hours prior." "Shortly after 9 this morning, yes. He believes Delacroix expired somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock last night." "Curious," Holmes murmured. He bent closer, lifting the goblet with care, sniffing its contents before setting it down again. "The claret has not merely cooled. It has lost the bouquet that lingers only a short time after decanting. This glass was poured not hours, but a day past, perhaps longer. And the meat, observe, Watson, how it has congealed. It is not the warmth of supper, but the chill of deceit." I could not suppress a shiver, the illusion of life undone by such trivial details. Holmes moved to the window, testing the latch, noting the faint traces of moisture on the sill. "Rain entered here within the last day, yet the latch is unstirred, suggesting it was left unfastened. A careless habit or deliberate neglect." He did not wait for an answer, but crouched beside the hearth, examining the ashes. With swift precision, he withdrew a fragment of paper, half charred, its ink still visible in places. He held it to the lamplight, eyes narrowing. "A letter, burned recently. Only the edge remains. Yet here, one phrase is legible. At midnight, as agreed. Interesting, is it not?" Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "Midnight. But if he died at 9 or 10... "Exactly," said Holmes. "The dead make poor correspondence. Who wrote this, and why should Delacroix expect a meeting he could never keep? That, gentlemen, is a question worthy of pursuit." Holmes turned suddenly and addressed the landlady, who had hovered anxiously at the threshold. "Madame, did your lodger receive visitors yesterday?" She hesitated. "Only one, sir. A young lady, most respectable, who came in the afternoon. They spoke in French, which I could not follow. She left before evening." Holmes's brows arched. "French, you say? And the victim, though long settled in London, bore a name of French extraction. Did you catch her appearance?" "Tall, dark hair beneath a veil. She seemed troubled, but polite. Holmes absorbed this silently, his mind already racing ahead. Then, with sudden abruptness, he addressed Lestrade. "Inspector, it is vital that we ascertain the precise hour this lady called, and if any servant or neighbor observed her departure. Also, the victim's scholarly acquaintances may prove enlightening. Delacroix, I believe, was engaged in certain historical researches of late." Lestrade scowled. "You've barely been here 5 minutes, Holmes, and already you're drawing conclusions. I suppose you'll be telling me who killed him before I've even had time to question the neighbors." Holmes offered a thin smile. "Patience, Lestrade. I'm not in the habit of revealing solutions before their time. Suffice it to say, the supper before us is a mask, and masks conceal not only faces, but motives. We must learn what this man studied, who sought him out, and why his corpse was arrayed to suggest a meal never taken. Only then shall we approach the truth." He fell silent, his gaze lingering once more upon the stiff figure at the table, as if listening for whispers the dead might impart. Then, with sudden energy, he gathered his coat. "Watson, we shall return to Baker Street. I have questions that must be answered through reflection and reference to my notes. Inspector, see that the body is removed with care, but disturb nothing further until I have time to reconsider the evidence." As we descended the narrow stair, I could not help but glance back at the chamber where Percy Delacroix sat eternally at his final meal. The sight was grotesque, yet curiously pitiful, and I felt the weight of mysteries pressing in like the fog outside. In the cab returning to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, his long fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed in contemplation. At last, he spoke in a low tone meant only for me. "Watson, you remarked that the supper seemed plain. Consider why. For a man of means to sup so humbly is not in itself remarkable, but when every detail is stage-managed, simplicity may be the most elaborate disguise of all." I turned to him, puzzled. "You believe the meal itself is a clue?" "I believe," Holmes replied with a faint smile, "that the key to this case lies not in the corpse, but in the menu." And with that enigmatic pronouncement, he lapsed once more into silence, leaving me to puzzle over his words as the cab rattled through the misty streets. The rattling of the cab wheels seemed to echo my own restless thoughts as we made our way back through the fog-bound streets to Baker Street. Holmes remained in that peculiar state of absorption which I had come to recognize as his most dangerous weapon. Silent, motionless, yet burning inwardly with suppressed energy. He gave no sign of interest in the rain-slicked streets or the occasional passer-by, until we alighted at our familiar door and mounted the stairs to our sitting-room. The fire Mrs. Hudson had laid earlier was still glowing faintly. Holmes went at once to the mantel, where he lit his long clay pipe and stood with his back to the blaze, the smoke wreathing about his angular features. His eyes gleamed with that curious inward light I had seen so often when some enigma had awakened his whole nature. I threw myself into my armchair, eager for explanation, but accustomed by long experience not to press him too early. For some minutes he puffed silently, his lean figure casting a sharp silhouette against the hearth. At last he spoke. "Watson, I dare say you noted the peculiarity of Mr. Delacroix's supper." "You mean its simplicity," I replied, recalling his enigmatic remark in the cab. "Beef, bread, claret, nothing remarkable at first glance?" "Precisely so. Yet when an elaborate illusion is contrived, every element must be considered. Why select so meagre a meal? Why not something finer? Game, a fowl, a sweetmeat." Delacroix had means enough to indulge himself, and yet the impersonation of a supper was staged with the plainest fare. I shrugged. Perhaps it was what the murderer had at hand. "Perhaps," Holmes echoed dryly. "Or perhaps the very plainness is itself a disguise. You see, Watson, when the ordinary is made to appear ordinary, it is often hiding the extraordinary." Before I could answer, he crossed suddenly to his desk, where he rummaged among a series of commonplace books, clippings, and his formidable index of criminal references. He drew forth a slim notebook bound in calfskin, its pages filled with his precise script. "Percy Delacroix," he muttered, scanning an entry. Formerly of Paris, scholar of medieval chronicles, particularly the Burgundian archives. Lived in London these 5 years, engaged in occasional lectures, reputed to possess a private collection of manuscripts. Connections in the French expatriate community. Nothing criminal but the hint of controversy. There was mention of a disputed document, was there not? Yes, a quarrel with a fellow historian over authenticity of a charter. I leaned forward. "Do you think his death is connected with his research?" "It is one possibility," Holmes said, closing the notebook with a snap. "Men have killed for less than a manuscript when national pride or personal reputation is at stake. But before we leap to conjecture, let us return to the facts. We have a body seated at supper, though dead many hours. We have a letter burned with mention of a midnight meeting. We have a mysterious lady caller, conversing in French. 3 separate strands. Yet I fancy they are plaited into one rope." He resumed his pacing, his brows knitted. I had learned that at such moments distraction often brought clarity to his mind. To test him, I picked up the evening paper and remarked upon an item concerning a society ball at Marlborough House. Holmes halted, fixing me with that sardonic smile I knew so well. "Ah, Watson, you are attempting to distract me, but you forget that even trifles contain their lessons. Allow me to demonstrate. According to that column, the Duke of Norfolk attended with his daughter. Observe the detail. She was said to have lost an earring during the evening, a pearl of considerable value." "Yes, so it states." "Then you may conclude, with certainty, that she danced vigorously with more than one partner." I laughed outright. "Holmes, that is absurd." "Not at all. A pearl earring does not fly off save with sudden and repeated motion. The mention of its loss is a discreet admission that the young lady's conduct was lively, perhaps more so than her father might wish. Thus, a single sentence betrays more than the chronicler intended. So it is with Delacroix's supper. The meal is an earring, Watson, a trifle, but a trifle that tells a tale." He resumed his seat, the faintest twinkle of amusement in his eyes. I knew then that he was slowly piecing together the mosaic in his mind. Presently, Lestrade was announced. The inspector's boots left damp marks on the carpet as he entered, looking both weary and dissatisfied. "I've done as you asked, Mr. Holmes. Questioned the neighbors and the servants. The lady in question was seen entering about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon and leaving an hour later. No one recognized her, though one maid thought her accent foreign. French, most likely." "Excellent," Holmes murmured. "And the physician's report?" "Confirms his first opinion. Death between 9 and 10 last night. Heart failure, he says, though I'm not convinced. No signs of poison, though he'll need further tests. Nothing stolen? No struggle?" Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "Heart failure may be the cloak of subtler means. We must not dismiss it, but neither must we accept it blindly. Tell me, Lestrade, was anything amiss in his papers, his library?" "Not that I could see. But then I wouldn't know a Burgundian charter if it bit me," Lestrade said with characteristic bluntness. Holmes smiled thinly. "Then it is fortunate that I would. Watson, tomorrow we shall visit the British Museum. I wish to confirm certain particulars of Delacroix's work. For now, Lestrade, instruct your men to watch for inquiries after that lady. If she is indeed French, she may be traced." Lestrade departed, muttering about Holmes's eccentric methods, leaving us once again to the quiet of our rooms. The hour was late, yet Holmes remained restless. He spread before him a series of clippings and letters, muttering occasionally as he compared them. At length he set down his pen and looked across at me. "Watson, do you perceive what is most remarkable about this case?" "That a man may dine after death," I replied, half in jest. Holmes' eyes glittered. Just so. It is not the murder alone that is singular, but the attempt to rewrite time itself. Someone sought to shift the hour of Delacroix's death, to create an alibi where none existed. Mark me, Watson, the entire supper is a false clock, set upon the table instead of the mantel. If we discover why the hour mattered, we shall know who killed him. I felt a thrill at his words, sensing that we stood upon the threshold of some deep intrigue. Yet, as ever, Holmes kept his conclusions veiled, allowing only tantalizing glimpses of the chain of reasoning that surely unfolded in his mind. As I retired at last, I reflected that we had but scratched the surface of a mystery far darker than we yet knew. Somewhere behind the fog and the whispers, a hand had arranged a grotesque masquerade of life, and Holmes alone possessed the clarity to strip away its mask. The next morning dawned with a pall of grey that seemed unwilling to lift. London lay beneath a blanket of drizzle, the pavement slick and shining, the air heavy with the mingled odours of damp horseflesh and coal smoke. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table when I descended, his long fingers toying idly with a slice of toast, while his eyes, sharp and restless, flicked over the columns of the Times. He looked up as I entered. "Ah, Watson, you are punctual." "Excellent. We have much to do today. Pray fortify yourself. Mrs. Hudson's eggs are not to be scorned, even if they lack the dramatic appeal of a corpse at supper." I sat opposite, shaking my head at his sardonic humour. "You mean to pursue Delacroix's researches?" "Just so. If the man's death is linked to his professional interests, and I would wager it is, then his circle of acquaintances will yield some clue. The British Museum will be our starting point. It is there, after all, that the scent of scholarly quarrels is thickest. Rivalry in academia, Watson, is more dangerous than rivalry in business, for while money wounds the purse, reputation wounds the soul. After breakfast, we set out, and soon were threading our way through the rain-flecked streets toward Bloomsbury. The great colonnaded facade of the museum loomed through the mist, its steps thronged with a few damp visitors clutching umbrellas. Inside, the familiar hush of stone halls welcomed us, broken only by the shuffle of footsteps and the murmured discussions of scholars bent over their tomes. Holmes had already written a note of introduction to the curator of manuscripts, and this gentleman, a pale, stooping fellow with pince-nez, received us in a chamber lined with glass cases and oak presses. Holmes wasted no time. "You were acquainted with Mr. Percy Delacroix, I believe." The curator sighed. "Acquainted, yes. He was a frequent visitor to our reading room, always in pursuit of some obscure chronicle or monastic account. Brilliant, but, if I may say so, not without enemies. He had lately aroused some ill will." Holmes inclined his head. "Ill will of what sort?" "A matter of authenticity. Delacroix had announced, rather prematurely, the discovery of a Burgundian charter which he claimed proved certain lands had belonged to the Abbey of Cluny in the 15th century. Professor Martigny, a fellow countryman and rival, denounced the document as a forgery. The quarrel grew heated. There were whispers, ugly ones, that Delacroix himself might have fabricated the charter to enhance his reputation. I saw Holmes's eyes glimmer. "And this Professor Martigny, where might one find him?" "He maintains lodgings near Russell Square. He was here only yesterday, storming about Delacroix and vowing to expose him publicly." Holmes murmured, "Indeed," with the air of one who tucks a card into his sleeve. He then inquired whether any of Delacroix's papers had been deposited at the museum. The curator shook his head, but produced instead the register of manuscripts Delacroix had lately consulted. Holmes perused the list with keen attention, pausing at one entry. Volume 1482, Chronique Bourguignonne. "Returned late yesterday afternoon, you say? Curious. Very curious." He made a mental note, thanked the curator with his customary abruptness, and we departed. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, and we sought a cab to Russell Square. Holmes leaned forward eagerly, his words tumbling with suppressed energy. "Watson, consider. Delacroix quarrels with Martigny over a disputed document. A midnight meeting is arranged. Why? Was it to settle the matter? To barter, perhaps, for silence? And then Delacroix is dead, his corpse posed at supper to conceal the hour. A rival scholar has both motive and opportunity. But surely, I objected, such quarrels, however bitter, would not lead to murder." Holmes smiled thinly. "You are charitable, Watson. Reputation is a more delicate jewel than life itself to certain men. Let us not underestimate the lengths to which envy may drive ambition." Our cab drew up before a tall house in Russell Square, its facade grimy with soot. We were admitted to a dingy sitting room where Professor Martigny soon appeared. He was a tall, cadaverous figure with a hawk-like nose and fierce dark eyes that glittered with suppressed fury. "You come about Delacroix," he said at once, his accent betraying his French origin. "Yes, I've heard the news. The man is dead. What of it? It is no loss to scholarship." Holmes regarded him coolly. "You quarreled with him." "Quarreled. He was a charlatan, a forger. He would have deceived the world with his lies, and I alone dared to expose him." "Strong words," Holmes observed. "You saw him yesterday." Martigny's eyes narrowed. "Yes, I confronted him at the museum. He blustered, he threatened. He said he would prove his charter genuine. Bah, he was desperate, a man on the brink of ruin." "Did you meet him later?" "In the evening, perhaps?" Holmes asked, his voice deceptively mild. The professor started, his sallow cheeks flushing. "No, I left him there. I returned home to my books. I saw no more of him." Holmes's gaze was steady. Yet a fragment of paper found in his grate spoke of a meeting at midnight, as agreed. With whom could he have arranged such an interview? Martigny's hands clenched. "Not with me. I would not soil my honor by dealing with a cheat." I observed his agitation with suspicion, but Holmes merely inclined his head. "Thank you, Professor. You have been most candid." Outside once more, I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes, you cannot believe him innocent. His anger, his enmity. He had every reason to strike." Holmes smiled cryptically. "Anger and enmity are indeed motives, but they are also masks. Consider, Watson, if Martigny wished to kill Delacroix, would he burn a letter hinting at a midnight meeting? Would he not rather ensure no trace of their quarrel remained? No, I think our net must be cast wider. Martigny is a fish that leaps too eagerly. The true culprit swims in deeper waters." As our cab rattled back across the square, Holmes grew thoughtful once again, his gaze fixed on the rain-smeared glass. At length he said, "Watson, this case pivots upon time. Why seat a corpse at supper? To suggest he was alive later than he was. To whom did that hour matter? Until we answer that, we remain in darkness." We returned to Baker Street by early afternoon, our boots heavy with mud. Holmes flung himself into his armchair, steepling his fingers. "There is another thread to follow, the lady visitor. We must learn who she was and why she sought Delacroix. Lestrade may blunder, but he is not without resources. Leave that matter with him. For ourselves, Watson, we shall trace Delacroix's manuscripts further. Somewhere in those chronicles lies the spark that lit this fire." I confess that by this stage my head was spinning with conjectures. The quarrel with Martigny, the mysterious lady, the midnight letter, the staged supper. Each strand seemed to point in a different direction, yet Holmes handled them with the ease of a juggler keeping half a dozen balls aloft. As evening fell, I watched him pace before the fire, his face alight with that fierce inner energy which made him at once so formidable and so exhausting a companion. "Watson," he said suddenly, "this case is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over another, with traces of the first text still visible. We must learn to read beneath the supper, beneath the quarrels, beneath the letter. Only then will the true design emerge. I could only nod, though my heart throbbed with anticipation. For all the shadows that enshrouded the matter, I knew that Holmes was already deciphering the hidden script. And though the path was obscured, I felt with certainty that each step drew us closer to the heart of the enigma. The following morning broke cold and clear, a reprieve from the relentless drizzle of the day before. A pale winter sun filtered through the curtains of Baker Street, casting long shafts of light upon the clutter of books, papers, and chemical apparatus that surrounded us. Holmes was already astir when I entered the sitting room, his dressing gown flung back, his hair in disarray, his eyes bright with the quick fire of discovery. Upon the table lay a scatter of slips from his voluminous index of crime and curious circumstance. "Watson," he cried, "our fish begins to nibble at the bait. I have received word from Lestrade. The lady who visited Delacroix has been traced." I started. "Indeed? Who is she?" "Her name is Mademoiselle Claire Dubois, recently arrived from Paris. She has taken a modest lodging in Fitzrovia. According to the landlady there, she is of gentle birth but reduced means. She admitted visiting Delacroix, though she claims it was merely to discuss certain family documents." "Family documents," I repeated, astonished. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Yes. She asserts that Delacroix had promised to examine a parchment relating to her grandfather's estates in Burgundy. Whether this be truth or subterfuge remains to be seen. We shall call upon her presently. But first, let us take stock." He strode to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and began to marshal the facts in his customary fashion. "We have 3 points of tension. First, the academic quarrel with Martigny. Second, the midnight letter burned in the grate. Third, the visit of this lady. Of the 3, the supper scene overlays all, for it attempts to falsify the chronology of death. The problem, Watson, is not who disliked Delacroix, but who required him to appear alive past 10 o'clock on Tuesday evening." I considered. Martigny's quarrel would not depend upon an hour, only upon the existence of the document. The lady, if she sought his aid, would likewise gain nothing by deception of time. Holmes smiled thinly. "Just so. Yet recall, Watson, that alibis are the currency of crime. If a man or woman needed to prove themselves elsewhere at 10, it would be convenient to show Delacroix alive later. The supper was not for Delacroix's sake. It was for the murderers." Before I could reply, Lestrade himself was shown in. He looked unusually satisfied, which with that inspector was rare indeed. "I fancy the matter grows clearer, Mr. Holmes," he announced. "We've been making inquiries, and it seems this Mademoiselle Dubois is not so innocent. She has been seen in company with none other than Professor Martigny, more than once too. They dined together at a cafe last week, and she was overheard quarreling with him in French." Holmes's brows rose, though his voice remained calm. "That is most illuminating, Inspector. And you conclude?" "That she is in league with him," Lestrade declared. "Plain as a pikestaff. She visits Delacroix, perhaps to spy out what he holds. Later, she returns with Martigny. They contrive this nonsense with the supper to mislead us, but the burned letter betrays their plot. I have half a mind to arrest them both." I could not help but be swayed by the inspector's confidence. The conjunction of the French lady with Delacroix's bitter rival was suggestive indeed. Yet Holmes merely drew at his pipe, his eyes half closed. "My dear Lestrade," he said softly, "your zeal does you credit. But before you clap irons upon either, let us hear Mademoiselle's own account. She may shed light where now we have only shadows." Reluctantly, Lestrade agreed to accompany us, and within the hour we were at the modest lodging-house in Fitzrovia, where Claire Dubois resided. She received us in a small parlour, sparsely furnished but neat, her dark hair veiled, her eyes reddened as though from recent tears. She was young, no more than 25, and there was a dignity in her bearing that impressed me despite her evident distress. Holmes addressed her with unusual courtesy. "Mademoiselle, forgive this intrusion. We come regarding the death of Monsieur Delacroix, with whom you were acquainted." Her lips trembled. "Yes, monsieur. I read it in the papers. It is terrible." "You visited him the day before his death," Holmes continued gently. "Might I ask the purpose?" She clasped her hands. "It was as I told the police. My family once possessed lands in Burgundy. There is dispute over the inheritance. Monsieur Delacroix was learned in such matters. He had promised to examine a parchment my father preserved. I brought it to him, but he said he must study it further." Holmes inclined his head. "And later, did you see him again?" "No, monsieur. I left at 5, that is all." Lestrade interjected brusquely, "And what of your meetings with Professor Martigny?" At this, her composure faltered. A flush rose in her cheeks. "Yes, I know him. He pressed me for news of Monsieur Delacroix. He thought to use me, to learn what documents Delacroix possessed. But I refused. I quarreled with him. He was angry, but I swear I had no part in this crime." Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away. I felt a pang of pity, though Lestrade muttered skeptically. Holmes, however, observed her with hawk-like scrutiny, noting every flicker of expression. At length he said quietly, "Mademoiselle, one more question. Did you by chance write to Monsieur Delacroix after your visit?" She shook her head vehemently. "No, I had no reason." Holmes bowed. "I thank you. That is all?" We left her lodgings, Lestrade muttering about her evasions. Yet Holmes seemed oddly thoughtful rather than convinced of her guilt. "Watson," he said as we walked back through the narrow streets, "did you mark her reaction to the mention of Martigny? Genuine indignation, yet mingled with fear. She knows more than she told us. But whether it points to complicity or merely to knowledge withheld, I cannot yet say. Still, her denial of correspondence is interesting, very interesting." I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled, enigmatically. If the burned letter was not from her hand, then from whose? And why destroy it? We tread upon thin ice, my dear fellow. The surface cracks, but the depths remain unseen. Back at Baker Street, Holmes threw himself once more into his armchair, his pipe between his teeth, while I recorded the day's events in my notebook. The evidence against Martigny and the French lady seemed strong. Motive, opportunity, and association. Yet my companion remained curiously reserved, as though sensing some flaw invisible to the rest of us. At last he spoke. "Lestrade sees a straight road, Watson, but I perceive a fork. It is too simple, too perfect, that Martigny and Claire Dubois should stand together as culprits. When the solution presents itself too readily, it is usually false. We must beware of accepting the gift horse without examining its teeth." I could only marvel once again at his caution. For myself, I felt certain that in Martigny's venom and the lady's distress lay the true key. But Holmes, as ever, walked his own path, and I knew better than to press him further. That night, as I extinguished the lamp and retired, I could not shake the image of Delacroix, seated forever at his final meal, and the haunting thought that the true murderer had not yet shown his face. The following day brought a subtle change in Holmes's manner. Where before he had paced and smoked in restless contemplation, he now moved with an air of deliberate purpose, as though some private line of reasoning had clarified in his mind. I found him seated at the breakfast table with a sheaf of notes before him, his coffee untouched, his eyes alight with suppressed excitement. "Watson," he said briskly, "today we put Lestrade's theory to the test. He sees Martigny and Mademoiselle Dubois as conspirators, and indeed appearances lend weight to that notion. But I distrust appearances. They are the very currency of deception. We must ask ourselves, what does the supper scene conceal, and who benefits most from that concealment?" Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanning its contents. A smile touched his lips. Ah, just as I expected. This is from the physician who examined Delacroix. He has completed further tests. Listen, Watson. No evidence of heart disease. Traces of digitalis found in stomach. Poisoning certain. Good heavens, I exclaimed. Then it was deliberate murder after all. Undoubtedly. And note the method, digitalis. It does not act instantly but slowly, sapping the heart's power until it falters. The victim would appear faint, then collapse. Yet the dose must be carefully timed. Whoever administered it knew something of such matters. Martigny, I ventured, or perhaps the lady. Holmes's smile was thin. Perhaps. But consider again the letter burned in the grate. It spoke of a meeting at midnight. If Delacroix was poisoned at supper, the supper itself must have been earlier than supposed. That letter, Watson, is the pivot. Find its author, and the entire illusion collapses. At that moment, Lestrade was announced. He entered in some triumph, a newspaper tucked beneath his arm. I have them now, Mr. Holmes. The evening edition reports that Martigny was seen near Delacroix's lodgings the very night of the murder. A cabman swears he set him down in Bloomsbury at 9:30. What say you to that? Holmes examined the paper without comment, then laid it aside. A cabman's word, Inspector, is not to be despised, but neither is it to be accepted untested. Did the cabman describe his fare? Lestrade looked affronted. Of course. Tall, dark, foreign-looking, wrapped in a heavy cloak. Matches Martigny to the letter. Or half the Frenchmen in London, Holmes murmured. Still, it is a lead. But before you act, Inspector, permit me to conduct an experiment. Watson and I shall visit Delacroix's rooms again this morning. Meet us there and bring your cabman. We set out shortly thereafter, and once again mounted the familiar stair to the chamber where the corpse had been discovered. The table still bore its grotesque burden of untouched food, though the body itself had been removed. The air was faintly tinged with disinfectant, mingling unpleasantly with the stale odor of cooked beef. Holmes surveyed the scene with renewed attention. He lifted the plate, examined the knife and fork, and then turned his gaze upon the hearth where the charred fragment of letter had been found. Stooping, he probed among the ashes with a slender instrument, producing a small scrap of wax. Red wax, impressed faintly with the curve of a seal. Observe, Watson. Whoever burned that letter did so in haste, and fragments remain. A seal suggests formality, perhaps an official communication, not the casual note of a lady to her confidant. This was no billet doux, but something sterner. Just then, Lestrade entered with the cabman in tow, a burly fellow with a ruddy face and a cap pulled low. He touched his forelock awkwardly as Holmes addressed him. You drove a gentleman to this house on Tuesday evening? Yes, sir. 9:30 it were. Tall cove, foreign sort, wrapped up in a cloak. Paid me fair, he did. Holmes regarded him steadily. You're certain of the hour? Certain as clockwork, sir. I'd just passed St. George's when the church bell struck the half-hour. And you say the man resembled Professor Martigny? Aye, sir, I'd swear to it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Swear lightly, my good fellow. The memory of a face glimpsed by lamplight is treacherous. Still, your evidence has weight. Thank you. When the cabman had gone, Lestrade exclaimed triumphantly, There you have it, Holmes. Martigny at the scene at the very hour. What more do you want? Holmes tapped the scrap of red wax thoughtfully. I want the truth, Inspector, not merely the likeness of it. Martigny may have come here, indeed the evidence suggests he did. But did he come to kill or for another purpose? And who sent this sealed letter bidding Delacroix to a midnight meeting he could never keep? Until we answer that, I will not place my neck in the halter of assumption. Lestrade grumbled, but Holmes was immovable. He pocketed the fragment of wax and declared, We must now seek knowledge at its source. Watson, to the French embassy. There we may learn who in London corresponds under such a seal. I suspect our case touches higher circles than poor Lestrade imagines. It was late afternoon when we presented ourselves at the embassy, our letters of introduction securing us an interview with the secretary. Holmes inquired, with his most urbane manner, whether Monsieur Delacroix had been engaged in any matter of state correspondence. The secretary hesitated, then admitted that Delacroix had lately offered to sell a manuscript of historical importance. One claimed to concern the succession of certain Burgundian estates, with potential implications for living families of rank. Holmes's eyes sharpened. And was this embassy interested? The secretary flushed. Naturally, sir, we had to consider it, but doubts of authenticity remained. Certain officials wished to meet him privately to examine the parchment further. A letter was sent, requesting him to bring it. At midnight, Holmes finished softly. The secretary started. Why, yes. How did you know? Holmes bowed, his expression unreadable. A mere conjecture, confirmed by your candor. You have my thanks. Outside once more, I could not contain my astonishment. Holmes! Then the letter was official, and the meeting real. But why would the embassy fix so unseasonable an hour? Because discretion thrives at midnight, Watson. They sought to avoid publicity. Yet mark the result. Delacroix was poisoned before he could attend, his body posed to conceal the true hour. Someone feared that meeting, someone who dreaded what might be revealed if the manuscript were examined by competent judges. I shivered in the gathering dusk. Then it is not a matter of petty rivalry at all, but of state intrigue? Holmes' lips curved faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps both. Envy and ambition are old bedfellows. We have not reached the heart yet, but the pulse quickens. Tonight, Watson, we keep vigil. If the murderer staged a supper to alter time, let us see what new performance he may attempt when he believes the stage is clear. And with that, Holmes hailed a cab, his eyes gleaming with that fierce light which told me we were on the brink of some decisive revelation. That evening, London seemed draped in a cloak of secrecy. A damp fog clung to the lampposts, muffling their glow, and the rattle of distant carriages carried with ghostly resonance through the streets. Holmes was in rare spirits as we dined hastily at Baker Street, though his appetite was limited to little more than a slice of bread and a cup of strong coffee. His eyes gleamed with the peculiar brightness that came upon him when he scented a climax approaching. "Watson," he declared as he donned his heavy ulster, "the play is nearing its second act. The murderer, having staged one performance at Delacroix's table, may be tempted to rehearse another, though perhaps not at so grotesque a scale. We must be ready to observe unseen. Tonight we keep watch outside those lodgings." I confessed to some reluctance. The memory of that chamber haunted me still, and the thought of lingering in its shadow on a raw November night was far from pleasant. Yet I could not resist Holmes's determination, and soon we found ourselves in a hansom rattling once more toward Bloomsbury. The house loomed dark as we approached, its narrow windows like blind eyes in the fog. Holmes led me to a side alley opposite, where a low wall and a cluster of leafless trees afforded some concealment. There we took up our vigil, the chill of the damp bricks seeping into our bones. For 2 hours, nothing stirred save the occasional constable making his rounds, or the muffled tread of a passer-by hurrying home. Holmes crouched motionless, his keen gaze fixed upon the house, his breath misting faintly in the air. I, less hardy, shifted from foot to foot and longed for the warmth of our fire. At last, near midnight, Holmes touched my arm. "Hush," he whispered. A shadow detached itself from the mist and crept toward the house. The figure was wrapped in a cloak, the hat pulled low, the gait furtive. We watched as he mounted the steps, fumbled at the door, and slipped inside with scarcely a sound. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve. "Come, Watson. The play begins." He led me swiftly across the street and up the stair, moving with a silence that belied his height. Producing a slender tool, he worked the lock with practiced ease, and in another moment we were inside, the stale odor of the place enveloping us. The intruder had left the parlor door ajar, and through the crack we beheld him. It was Martigny. His hawk-like features glimmered pale in the lamplight as he moved about the room with nervous haste. He went directly to the desk, rifling among the papers, muttering under his breath in French. Then he produced a small file from his pocket, examined it briefly, and replaced it with trembling hands. Holmes's eyes blazed with triumph. "So, Watson, our fish returns to the bait." We stepped forward together. Martigny wheeled, his face contorting with shock and fury. "You, what are you doing here?" he hissed. "That question, sir, is better put to yourself," Holmes retorted coldly. "Why do you haunt the chamber of the dead, seeking to erase what you cannot conceal?" Martigny's composure broke. "He ruined me," he cried. "Delacroix would have destroyed my reputation with his lies. He forged that charter, I am sure of it. I came to prove it, to find his drafts, his notes. Yes, I quarreled with him, but I did not kill him. I swear it upon my honor." Holmes stepped closer, his voice like a whip. "And yet you carried a phial of digitalis. What need has a scholar of such a drug, unless he seeks to still a rival's heart?" The professor's hands trembled. "It is not mine. It was his. He used it for his ailments. I know nothing of it." Before more could be said, the door burst open and Lestrade entered with 2 constables, lanterns flaring. His eyes widened at the scene. "Well, well, Martigny, caught red-handed. That settles it." The professor paled, sagging against the desk. No, I'm innocent." But Lestrade had already snapped the irons upon his wrists. "You'll tell that to the magistrate. I've had my doubts, but this is proof enough." Holmes remained silent until the prisoner had been led away, then turned to me with a curious expression. "Too neat, Watson. Far too neat. The digitalis, the papers, the clandestine visit, it is arranged like a stage set. And yet—" He broke off, pacing the chamber, his brows drawn in fierce concentration. "You doubt his guilt?" I asked in astonishment. "Why, we saw him with our own eyes." Holmes stopped short, his gaze piercing me. "Yes, we saw him, and what more natural than that he should seek evidence against his rival? But poison, Watson, poison is the weapon of the subtle hand, not of a man who storms and rails in public. No, the truth eludes us still. Martigny may be guilty of arrogance, but I question whether he is guilty of murder." We returned to Baker Street in the small hours, weary and chilled. Yet Holmes showed no sign of fatigue. He cast himself into his chair, his pipe glowing fiercely, his eyes burning with that strange inward fire. "Watson," he said at last, "we have reached the heart of the misdirection. Martigny is the scapegoat, dangled before us with tempting obviousness. But someone else, someone who understood Delacroix's dealings with the embassy, who had access to poison, who needed the hour of death shifted, someone of far keener design, moves behind the curtain. Until we unmask that hand, the case remains unsolved." I could only nod, though my own mind still clung to the sight of Martigny rifling through those papers. Yet I had learned to trust Holmes's instincts, however paradoxical they appeared. The mystery of the man who dined after death was deepening, and I sensed we had yet to touch the core of its darkness. The morning that followed our midnight vigil found Holmes uncharacteristically silent. He had not retired until near dawn, and when I descended for breakfast, I discovered him slouched in his chair, pipe in hand, surrounded by a litter of notes and newspaper clippings. Though his lids drooped heavily, his gaze was sharp, restless, and full of that smoldering energy which told me his mind was already 3 moves ahead upon the chessboard of the case. "Watson," he murmured without preamble, "Martigny's arrest will gratify Lestrade and satisfy the public appetite for swift justice. Yet I tell you plainly, it is a false solution. The man is vain, quarrelsome, arrogant to the point of folly, but he is no poisoner. He rails too loudly to stoop to stealth." I ventured that the phial of digitalis might prove otherwise. Holmes shook his head. Placed for effect, my dear fellow. Theatrical, almost clumsy. A true poisoner hides his hand, not flaunts it. No, our enemy is subtler and more dangerous. We must look to the embassy once again. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with a note delivered by special messenger. Holmes tore it open, his brows arching. Ha! As I thought. Listen, you are requested to attend the French embassy this afternoon regarding the matter of Delacroix's manuscripts. Confidential. Signed, the same secretary we met yesterday. He tossed the note aside. They are uneasy, Watson. Uneasy men talk, and talking men betray secrets. We shall go. That afternoon we were ushered once more through the grand stone halls of the embassy, where the tricolour drooped languidly in the damp air. The secretary greeted us with courtesy, though his manner was more strained than before. He led us to a private chamber, shutting the door carefully before speaking. Monsieur Holmes, he began, I must trust your discretion. The matter touches delicate interests. Monsieur Delacroix did indeed bring us word of a charter, one of great potential consequence. Should it be genuine, certain noble families in France might claim estates long disputed. You see at once the political weight of such a document. Holmes inclined his head. And naturally, there are those who would discredit Delacroix, or prevent his evidence from reaching you. The secretary's face tightened. Precisely. We arranged a meeting at midnight to examine the parchment, but now he is dead, and the manuscript is missing. Missing, I exclaimed. Vanished from his rooms. Your police searched thoroughly. Nothing remains. Holmes's eyes glittered. That is suggestive. If Martigny were the culprit, he would seize upon the manuscript as proof of fraud, not destroy it. But if another hand wished to prevent its scrutiny, what better than to remove it entirely? The secretary hesitated, then added, There is also the matter of Mademoiselle Dubois. She is distantly connected with one of the families concerned. Some whisper she was sent here to recover the parchment for their cause. I started at this, recalling her tearful protestations of innocence. Holmes, however, betrayed no surprise. So the net widens, he said softly. Thank you, sir. You have been candid. That is all I require, for now. We left the embassy in silence. As our cab rattled toward Baker Street, I could restrain myself no longer. Holmes, do you believe the lady complicit after all? He shook his head. Her distress struck me as genuine, Watson, but she may be a pawn, moved by hands she does not perceive. The more dangerous adversary is one who understands both the value of the document and the power of appearances. Remember the supper. Remember the letter. Both were stagecraft, designed not merely to kill, but to confound time and motive. Back at our rooms, Holmes flung himself into his armchair, staring moodily at the ceiling through wreaths of smoke. I waited in silence, knowing better than to intrude upon his thoughts. At length he sprang up, seized his violin, and drew from it a few harsh chords that echoed strangely through the chamber. Then he laid it aside and turned to me with sudden decision. Watson, tonight we must call upon Mademoiselle Dubois again. Her tears may be true, but truth itself can be dangerous. I wish to test her with one question only, one which she cannot answer without revealing more than she intends. That evening found us once more in Fitzrovia. The lady received us with evident agitation. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembled. Holmes, however, wasted no time upon courtesies. Mademoiselle, he said gravely, you told us you left Monsieur Delacroix at 5 o'clock on Tuesday. I ask you now, did you carry away with you the parchment you had shown him? Her eyes widened in horror. No, I swear it. He kept it. He said he must compare it with others. I never saw it again. Holmes's gaze was piercing. And yet it is gone. Who else knew you brought it? She faltered. Only Professor Martini pressed me with questions. But I told him nothing. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Very well, mademoiselle. That is all. We withdrew, leaving her near collapse with anxiety. As we walked back through the fog, I asked, "What did you gain from that, Holmes?" "Confirmation," he replied. "She did not lie, though she is entangled. The parchment remained with Delacroix until after her departure. It disappeared only after his death. Therefore the thief is the murderer, and the murderer is someone who needed both the hour shifted and the document suppressed. Martigny fits one condition, but not the other. Our quarry lies elsewhere." When we reached Baker Street, a surprise awaited us. Lestrade was pacing the sitting room, his face flushed with excitement. "Holmes, you'll not believe it. Another crime. A second victim." My heart leapt. Good heavens, who? "A clerk from the embassy," Lestrade said grimly. "Found dead in his rooms not an hour ago. Poison, the doctor thinks. The same method as Delacroix." Holmes's eyes flared with a fierce light. "The second act, indeed. Watson, the curtain rises upon a darker play than even I imagined." The announcement of a second death struck me with the force of a blow. For a moment I could only stare at Lestrade, scarcely able to comprehend his words. Yet Holmes, instead of displaying surprise, leaned forward with an eagerness that revealed how completely the new development had already fitted itself into the intricate design forming in his mind. "Describe everything, Inspector," he demanded sharply. Lestrade rubbed his hands. "Name of Henri Fournier, clerk at the embassy. Quiet fellow, no enemies anyone knows of. He was found this evening in his lodgings near Soho, slumped in his chair. Empty wine glass on the table. Doctor says digitalis again, same as Delacroix. I tell you, Holmes, it's Martigny beyond doubt. He's silencing those who might expose him." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Or perhaps, Inspector, someone is ensuring Martigny appears guilty. Reflect, Fournier was no rival scholar, no claimant to manuscripts. Why should Martigny trouble to poison a mere clerk?" Lestrade opened his mouth, then shut it again with a scowl. "Then who, in heaven's name?" "That, Inspector, is precisely what we must discover. Come, Watson, we go at once to the scene." Within the hour we were in Fournier's modest lodgings. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of spilled wine, and the poor fellow's body had already been removed. Yet Holmes's keen eye darted from detail to detail. He examined the glass, sniffed the dregs, and then inspected the papers upon the desk. "A ledger," he murmured, turning the pages rapidly. "Embassy accounts, and here, entries regarding payments for private acquisitions. Ah, this is enlightening indeed." He tapped a line with his long finger. "Note, Watson, a disbursement last week to Delacroix. The embassy paid him a handsome sum on account of the Burgundian parchment. Yet the document had not been authenticated. Why pay before proof?" "Perhaps to secure it," I suggested. "Precisely. But such haste betrays urgency, and urgency implies danger. Someone feared another might obtain it first, that someone had the means to release funds, and Fournier recorded the transaction. Now he is dead, and the ledger remains." Holmes's eyes burned with fierce satisfaction. The pattern sharpens. Delacroix dead, his manuscript vanished. Fournier dead, who recorded its purchase, and both deaths dressed in the garb of poison. This is no feud between scholars, Watson. It is conspiracy. At that moment, a constable entered, bearing a sealed envelope. "Found in the grate, sir, half burned." Holmes seized it eagerly. Though singed, enough remained legible. "Dangerous to proceed. Suspicions aroused. Meeting postponed. Midnight no longer safe." The signature was destroyed. Holmes read it twice, then thrust it into his pocket. "We have our line, gentlemen. Let us return to Baker Street. I must think." All the way back, Holmes sat in silence, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes closed. But I knew that behind those lids his brain worked with the swiftness of lightning. Once in our sitting room he sprang up, paced the floor, then turned upon Lestrade with sudden vehemence. "Inspector, release Martigny at once." Lestrade nearly choked. "Release him? Are you mad? We caught him in the act, prowling among Delacroix's papers with poison in his pocket." "Bah, props upon a stage," Holmes retorted. "He is guilty of trespass, of folly, of envy, but not of murder. The true criminal walks free, confident that your eyes are fixed upon the wrong man. Every hour Martigny languishes in jail, the real hand moves unchecked. I tell you, Inspector, release him." Lestrade blustered, but beneath Holmes's glare his resistance faltered. "Very well," he muttered at last. "I'll speak to the magistrate in the morning. But if you're wrong, Holmes—" "I am not wrong," Holmes cut in. "Now leave me. I have work to do." When the inspector had departed, Holmes flung himself into his chair, steepled his long fingers, and addressed me. "Watson, we stand at a perilous juncture. The second crime proves what I suspected, that Delacroix's death was not an isolated act of rivalry, but part of a larger design. The parchment is the center of it, and around it whirl motives of ambition, pride, and fear." "But who gains, Holmes?" I asked. "Who profits by suppressing it?" He smiled grimly. "That, my dear fellow, is the question. A forged charter could ruin reputations. A genuine one could alter fortunes. Either way, it held power, and power attracts dangerous men. Someone sought to buy silence with gold, and when gold failed, with poison." I shivered. "And you believe that someone moves within the embassy?" Holmes nodded. "Where else? Fournier's ledger ties the matter to official hands. But which? That is the riddle. We must bait the hook and see which fish rises." He rose, pacing with restless energy. "Tomorrow, Watson, we pay another visit to the embassy, but not as ourselves. A disguise, a faint inquiry, a casual word in the right ear. These are the tools we must employ, for if we walk openly, the criminal will retreat deeper into shadow, and I intend to drag him into the light." That night I scarcely slept, so vivid were the impressions crowding upon me. Delacroix seated eternally at his last supper, Martigny's pale face in the lamplight, the trembling distress of Claire Dubois, and now the silent form of poor Fournier struck down for the knowledge he had recorded. It was as though a web of intrigue had woven itself across London, its threads invisible save to Holmes's piercing gaze. When dawn came at last, I found him still at the table, pen in hand, a small array of wigs and false whiskers laid out beside him. He looked up with a flash of grim humour. "Watson, today you shall be my secretary from Oxford, versed in medieval Latin. I, alas, must content myself with the part of a shabby bibliophile seeking access to archives. Between us, we shall probe the embassy's armour. Somewhere within those walls lies the truth, and I mean to have it." The next day broke with a brittle chill, the streets glazed with frost that gleamed faintly beneath the weak December sun. Holmes was already in his element by the time I roused myself. His array of disguises had been reduced to two carefully chosen ensembles. He himself wore the threadbare coat of a scholarly antiquarian, complete with ink-stained cuffs and a dusty wig that transformed his features into those of a man long buried in manuscripts. For me, he had prepared a neat but provincial suit, a pair of spectacles, and a sheaf of notes filled with Latin quotations scrawled in his meticulous hand. "You are to be Dr. Wilmot, late of Oxford, with pretensions in medieval paleography," he explained, fastening the wig firmly to his brow. "You need only nod gravely and say 'quite so' when addressed. As for myself, I shall be your humble assistant, one bibliophile peregrine, seeking crumbs from the great table of scholarship. Together we shall test the embassy's armour." By mid-morning we presented ourselves once more at the French embassy. This time, however, our entrance caused no ripple of recognition. We were received with the polite indifference afforded to obscure savants. Holmes, or rather Peregrine, spoke in a mumbling monotone of a desire to consult the Burgundian collections. I, in my role as Dr. Wilmot, added a few solemn remarks upon pale ink and monastic abbreviations, at which our host bowed deeply and ushered us toward the archives. The reading room was lofty and cold, with tall windows admitting a pale wash of winter light. Several clerks bent over their desks, while in one corner a gentleman of military bearing conversed in low tones with a secretary. Holmes's eyes flickered there only once before settling upon the shelves. He began pulling down volumes at random, turning the pages with ostentatious absorption while murmuring to me under his breath. "Observe, Watson, there sits Colonel Delaunay, military attaché, whose hand, I suspect, reaches farther than his uniform suggests. Note the air of command, the restless glance. He is not here to study chronicles. We must provoke him." A clerk approached us, offering assistance. Holmes seized the opportunity to inquire, in his assumed nasal tone, whether any recent acquisitions from Burgundy had been catalogued. The clerk hesitated, then replied that such matters were handled by Colonel Delaunay personally. "Ah," Holmes exclaimed, his false stoop suddenly animated, "then perhaps the colonel will indulge a humble student of charters. The authenticity of Burgundian documents is a passion of mine." Our words had reached Delaunay's ear. He turned sharply, his moustache bristling, and strode across the room. His voice was courteous, yet edged with steel. "You are interested in Burgundian charters, monsieur. They are contentious." Holmes bowed obsequiously. "Only for their paleographic quirks, sir. I have heard whispers of a certain parchment, one once in Monsieur Delacroix's hands. Might such a treasure be accessible?" The colonel's eyes flashed. "Delacroix is dead. His forgeries concern us no more. As for documents, the embassy retains nothing of doubtful origin." His tone was final, dismissive, yet I saw his gloved hand tighten upon his riding crop. Holmes murmured apologies, retreating once more into his scholar's mutterings, but when Delaunay turned away, his eyes gleamed with suppressed triumph. "Watson," he whispered, "the man overplays his hand. Too quick to dismiss, too eager to discredit. He fears that parchment. I would wager my violin he knows where it lies." We feigned study for another hour, then withdrew, leaving behind the hushed air of the archives. Outside, Holmes shook off his wig and spectacles, his true self re-emerging as though from a chrysalis. "Colonel Delaunay," he said, "is our man. Mark his denial. He called the parchment a forgery. Yet how could he judge unless he had seen it? Fournier's ledger shows a payment. Delacroix was to bring the charter. Fournier is dead." The chain tightens. Delaunay suppresses the manuscript, poisons those who might reveal its path, and sets Martigny as scapegoat with theatrical ease. Elegant, is it not? But the motive, Holmes? Surely state secrets cannot hinge upon a medieval charter. Holmes smiled grimly. "You underestimate pride, Watson. For certain families in France, the parchment meant claims of land, wealth, and precedence. To discredit it was to preserve the status quo. Delaunay acts not merely for ambition, but for the protection of interests greater than himself. And yet, murder is murder, even beneath the cloak of diplomacy." We returned to Baker Street to find Lestrade awaiting us once more, his patience evidently near its end. "Well, Holmes, have you discovered our mysterious phantom yet? I've loosed Martigny, as you insisted, though I'll own it sticks in my throat. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, Inspector." Holmes cut in, his eyes glittering. "Prepare yourself. The time has come for a snare. Tonight we bait it with truth and watch who springs." He produced from his pocket a neat envelope, freshly sealed. Within this lies our lure, a forged message purporting to be from Fournier, hinting that copies of his ledger and the parchment itself are secured and will be revealed at dawn. Deliver it quietly into Delaunay's hands, and then withdraw. He will not resist the chance to silence one more witness. We shall be the witnesses instead." Lestrade looked doubtful. But Holmes's authority was not to be gainsaid. "Very well," he muttered. "But if this fails—" "It will not fail," Holmes replied. "The colonel believes himself safe, with Martigny disgraced and Fournier in his grave. But pride, Watson. Pride blinds. He cannot resist one final act to secure himself." That evening, as the fog thickened once more over the city, we took our positions near a warehouse by the river where Holmes had contrived the meeting to occur. The hour crept on, the chill gnawed at our bones, and silence pressed heavily upon us. At last, footsteps sounded. Firm, measured, military. A cloaked figure approached, pausing to glance around before slipping inside. Holmes touched my arm, his whisper taut with anticipation. "The fish has risen, Watson. Now, let us strike." The warehouse on the Thames was a cavern of shadows. The wind off the river moaned through the cracks in its boards, carrying the brackish scent of low tide. Holmes and I crouched behind a stack of barrels, Lestrade and 2 constables positioned silently at the far end. My heart pounded in my ears, for I knew the decisive moment of the drama had arrived. The cloaked figure we had glimpsed entered cautiously, striking a match to light a lantern he had brought. The sudden glow revealed Colonel Delaunay's stern features, his mustache gleaming like a saber under the dim light. He laid the lantern upon a crate and drew from his coat a pistol, which he placed within easy reach. His eyes swept the gloom with the wary assurance of a soldier accustomed to danger. Holmes's breath touched my ear. "Observe, Watson, the careful preparation of a man who fears ambush. He expects resistance. He believes Fournier, or one speaking for him, waits within. Let us see how far he will go." Delaunay drew from his pocket the envelope Lestrade had delivered earlier, and I could see the faint impression of Holmes's forgery still intact. He slit it open, scanning the contents quickly, then crushed the note in his fist with a curse in French. "So, Fournier thought to betray me," he muttered. "But he will not succeed. I shall end it tonight." With that, he moved deeper into the warehouse, eyes searching for the promised ledger or parchment. Holmes, with the swiftness of a striking hawk, rose from concealment and stepped into the lantern's glow. "Colonel Delaunay, your play is finished," he said coldly. The Frenchman spun, his hand darting for the pistol, but Lestrade and his men surged forward. In an instant, the weapon was wrenched away, and Delaunay found himself encircled, the lamplight glaring upon his furious face. "Stand aside," he thundered, his accent thickening with rage. "You have no authority here. I'm a servant of my country." Holmes's gaze was implacable. "You are a servant of murder, Colonel. You poisoned Percy Delacroix to prevent his parchment from reaching scrutiny. You posed his body at supper to shift the hour of death, thereby securing your alibi. And when Henri Fournier's ledger threatened to betray your payment, you silenced him also. The stagecraft was ingenious, but not ingenious enough." The colonel's jaw tightened. "Lies! Delacroix was a forger. I protected France from scandal." "By digitalis in his wine," Holmes retorted. "By a false tableau at his table. By burning letters and scattering wax seals. I tell you, sir, your methods betray you. You staged supper for a dead man because you needed him alive beyond 10 o'clock, the hour when you yourself were seen elsewhere at a reception. The deception served only you." Lestrade stepped forward, his hand heavy upon Delaunay's shoulder. "You'd best come quietly, Colonel." But the Frenchman shook him off with sudden violence, his eyes blazing. "I will not be paraded like a criminal. I acted for honor, for state, for the pride of France." Holmes's voice cut through his fury like ice. "Honor does not sit at table with death, Colonel. Murder is no patriotism." For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the lap of the river against the pilings. Then Delaunay sagged, his defiance faltering. "You meddle in affairs beyond you," he said bitterly. Yes, I sought to bury the parchment. Its claims would have ignited quarrels across provinces, undermined families whose loyalty is vital to France. Delacroix was reckless. Fournier was weak. I did what was necessary. Holmes regarded him with something approaching pity. Necessary, perhaps, to you, but monstrous to justice. You forgot that truth, however inconvenient, cannot be drowned by poison. It resurfaces, like the tide you hear beneath us. Lestrade gave the signal, and the constables closed in. Delaunay offered no further resistance as the irons were fastened upon his wrists. Yet his eyes, when they met Holmes's, burned with an undiminished fire, as if he still believed himself the hero of his own tale. When he had been led away, Lestrade turned to Holmes with mingled triumph and relief. By George, Holmes, I doubted you at every turn, but you've done it again. I'll see this Frenchman charged before the week is out. Holmes's expression remained grave. Do not congratulate yourself too swiftly, Inspector. The law may falter when diplomacy intervenes. He may yet slip through your fingers. Lestrade scowled. If he does, it won't be my fault. With that, he departed with his men, leaving Holmes and me alone in the cavernous gloom. Holmes extinguished the lantern and stood listening to the river. Watson, he said at last, do you not see the tragedy? Delaunay was no common assassin. He persuaded himself he acted for honor, and in so persuading justified any crime. Such men are doubly dangerous, for conscience itself becomes their accomplice. We walked out into the fog, the chill air a relief after the closeness of the warehouse. As we hailed a cab, I asked, "And the parchment, Holmes? Does it still exist?" Holmes shook his head. Destroyed, I fancy, in the very hour Delacroix died. Delaunay would never risk its discovery. We may never know whether it was genuine or forged. Yet in truth it matters little. The lives it claimed, the lies it cloaked, these are the real record, and they are damning enough. Back at Baker Street, Holmes threw himself into his chair, weary but still restless, his mind not yet satisfied. I longed for a conclusion, yet I knew from experience that he would not pronounce his full judgment until every strand of the web had been displayed. "Watson," he said, his voice softening, "I shall give you the complete account tomorrow. Tonight let us rest, but mark this. When the curtain falls, you will see that the supper of a dead man was but the opening act of a drama that reached into the very heart of international ambition." I could only nod, struck anew by the strange, formidable power of his mind. The fire crackled, the fog pressed against the panes, and in the stillness of Baker Street I felt that we stood on the threshold of revelation, the final truth poised to break upon us with the inevitability of dawn. The next morning broke with a faint glimmer of sun piercing the fog, as though London itself sought relief from the gloom of recent days. I found Holmes at the breakfast table, a single sheet of foolscap before him upon which he had arranged his notes in the crisp, ordered fashion that marked his mind when the end of a case was at hand. He greeted me with a nod, poured himself a cup of coffee, and settled back into his chair with the air of a lecturer ready to address his student. "My dear Watson," he began, "our little drama has reached its denouement. You have observed every act, and yet I doubt whether the entire plot stands clear before you. Allow me, then, to illuminate the shadows." I leaned forward eagerly, pen in hand, determined to capture every nuance of his reasoning. "First," he said, "let us consider the grotesque tableau of Percy Delacroix seated at supper. That image was not mere whimsy. It was the linchpin of the murderer's scheme. By arranging the body with food and drink, Delaunay sought to convince us that Delacroix had lived later than he had. The true hour of death was around 9 o'clock, but the supper suggested life well past 10. Why? Because at 10 o'clock, Colonel Delaunay was attending a reception at the embassy. He needed Delacroix alive beyond that hour to establish his alibi. Thus, the false supper was a clock upon the table, set to deceive. I nodded, recalling the chill that had struck me when first I glimpsed the stiff figure before his plate. Second, Holmes continued, we have the burned letter. Its fragment, at midnight as agreed, was genuine, not invention. The embassy had indeed summoned Delacroix to a secret interview, hoping to examine the Burgundian parchment. Delaunay, however, resolved that Delacroix would never arrive. He poisoned him beforehand with digitalis, then staged the body to conceal the true time. By burning the letter, he attempted to erase proof of the meeting, though fate left us a telling scrap. And Fournier? I asked. Why was he killed? Holmes's eyes darkened. Because his ledger betrayed the truth. It recorded the embassy's payment to Delacroix, a payment Delaunay had authorized in his zeal to control the parchment. Had the ledger been seen, it would have revealed that the embassy believed the document important, whether genuine or not. Fournier's silence became essential. So he, too, was poisoned, and his papers rifled. Delaunay imagined he had struck out every trace. He paused to refill his cup, his voice resuming with a cool precision. As for Martigny, he was but a convenient scapegoat. His public quarrel with Delacroix, his arrogance, his French origin, all pointed suspicion neatly in his direction. Delaunay counted on Lestrade's zeal to seize upon the obvious. He even planted the file of digitalis among Delacroix's effects, knowing Martigny's later intrusion would appear incriminating. That we caught him prowling was chance, but a chance that nearly destroyed him. He was guilty of folly, but innocent of murder. I could not suppress an exclamation. Then Claire Dubois, what of her? Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. An unwitting pawn. She did indeed seek Delacroix's counsel regarding her family's estates. Delaunay, learning of her connection, sought to exploit her visit as further confusion. She was drawn into the web but bore no guilt. Her tears were genuine, her indignation sincere. She will return to France with her honor unsullied. Holmes leaned back, the smoke of his pipe curling upward. And so you see, Watson, the entire sequence. Delacroix dies by poison, his corpse arranged to mislead. A letter burned, a ledger destroyed, a scapegoat paraded, all the elements of stagecraft, woven together by a mind both ruthless and ingenious. But he miscalculated in one respect. He underestimated the scrutiny of detail. The congealed beef, the flat claret, the scrap of wax from a seal. These trifles exposed the deception. From such trifles does truth emerge. I sat in silence, my admiration for his method deepening with every word. At last I asked, and the parchment itself, Holmes, was it genuine? He shook his head slowly. That, my dear Watson, we shall never know. Delaunay destroyed it, I am convinced, within hours of Delacroix's death. To him, it mattered not whether it was true or false. Its mere existence threatened interests he had sworn to defend. In that sense, the parchment was both everything and nothing, the shadow around which two men lost their lives. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Then Holmes spoke again, his tone softer, almost reflective. There is a peculiar tragedy in this case, Watson. Delaunay persuaded himself that he acted for honor, for France, for stability, for the preservation of old families, and yet in the name of honor he stooped to poison and deception. It is ever the danger of men who cloak ambition in virtue. Conscience itself becomes their accomplice. I scribbled his words as faithfully as I could, though my own heart was heavy. And what will become of him now? Holmes shrugged. That lies with the law and with diplomacy. Lestrade may charge him, but the embassy will resist. He may escape punishment, at least in the courts. But guilt is its own jailer. He will never dine in peace again, for he knows he once made a dead man dine. With that, Holmes rose, stretched his long limbs, and reached for his violin. He drew from it a low, haunting strain that filled the room with melancholy. I sat watching him, thinking how strange a man he was, at once cold as logic and yet capable of a depth of moral indignation that humbled me. At length he set down the bow and looked across at me with a faint smile. "Come, Watson. The world will soon present us with another puzzle. Until then, let us content ourselves with the satisfaction that, for once, deception has been laid bare, and the dead may dine no more." And so the case closed, with Colonel Delaunay disgraced, Martigny vindicated, Claire Dubois freed from suspicion, and the memory of Delacroix forever bound to that macabre tableau. To Holmes, it was but another exercise in deduction. To me, it was a lesson in the perilous interplay of pride, honor, and ambition. As I laid down my pen, I could not resist one final thought, that no supper, however artfully staged, could ever mask the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes's mind.